Okay, so a decent amount of housekeeping stuff. So I apologize about yesterday. I got the announcement up late because I was not expecting to have to cancel class yesterday. It shouldn't cause too much of a disruption kind of moving forward. So I'll kind of outline that. I tried to be thorough in the announcement that I posted, but just to kind of hit on some main points. If you haven't read through that announcement, so the exam two scores are currently up on Canvas. You can kind of review those questions, go back through the ones you got incorrect. Um, my suspicion was true, which is that I saw abnormally high scores on that first exam, and I'm assuming that people were using some materials that they weren't really supposed to be, given the instructions. This honor lock system, the reason why I use it is because it polices that a little bit more. I know that it's probably a little bit, that's why I put up the test version of it to kind of make sure you had things working before you took the actual exam. I think some people didn't actually even submit that, or they didn't, just kind of logged on to kind of get it real quick. I wanted you to kind of actually kind of go through it to see how it works. Now we should have a better idea. I'll be using it for the final as well. Scores were significantly lower on this second midterm, which tells me that not having these outside resources, maybe you weren't kind of studying enough or approaching it seriously enough. Those quizzes, once again, I'm not using it. And so you have all available resources. That's not really going to be the most accurate reflection of your understanding if you're using these additional materials that are outside of just doing it from your own kind of understanding, right? And so I think putting a little more time into studying for this final will help a lot of people, knowing that you will only have availability of whatever notes you have in front of you. You cannot open up any other kind of browsers, anything like that. Now, I mentioned when things get flagged, I was probably trying to, I don't want to say scare you, but I can observe all those flags as long as it was nothing serious. And I went through all of them actually. It's not like just because you get flagged, it was going to be, your exam score is going to be thrown out. It's just kind of a matter of checks and balances. And so one thing I noticed that was pretty frequent, and if you can try to do this before the next one, is to turn off like your notifications. So a lot of times it would cause some disruption because you'd get like a text alert or something on your on your laptop or an email alert. So try to have everything closed out. Maybe look at settings and try to close your notifications out before taking that exam. That'll kind of help some of these flag issues. Okay. I'll put together a more extensive list prior to the final, some things that I noticed on that second midterm exam to make sure that you're doing, just like I mentioned, to make sure you're not getting some of those disruptions. So the average is quite a bit lower. Um, Now, if I look at the average across the two exams, it was generally right around where I would like to see it for an in-person class. So, I think that final exam scores will probably go up a little bit now that we know what to kind of expect with that honor lock system. However, I, wanted to make some available extra credit, so I have what looks like a quiz or assignment that is due by the end of the day today. So I outlined this in my announcement yesterday. It's really just a survey. So it'll score it. So don't worry about the grade you're seeing currently for that. As soon as that due date passes, I'm going to go back through and actually update this to be every question was worth a single point. So if you answered all the questions, you'll get 4 points added to your exam score. I want to say 4 points. Currently, the exam score you see is out of 25. It'll be 4 percentage points. So if you had an 80, it would go up to an 84%. Okay. Um, I also put up this hypothetical grade tool. So it's just an Excel file. And what you can do, right, is plug in whatever your scores in the various categories are. So here I have like module readings, in-class quizzes, Canvas discussions, the kind of other, main quizzes, your exam scores. And then you can kind of play around with this final exam and see if I get this on the final, what would my final grade be? Now it assumes that you kind of keep completing the homework assignments at your current rate. Now at the end of the semester, once again, I drop your lowest module reading, lowest two in-class quizzes, so these scores could go up a little bit, but this gives you a pretty good idea of going into that final about what you would need to get your desired grade in the class. Okay. So currently what I have the grade book on Canvas doing is taking the weight of the final and putting the weight of that final on, so we'll come down here, kind of spreading it out across those first two exams. Now that might be a little bit overinflated because like I mentioned before, the exam scores on midterm one were abnormally high, be a little bit misleading in that if you were using some outside materials, you probably aren't going to score as quite as high on that, final as you did in exam one, but that's kind of how I currently have Canvas set up. Okay. So, I highly suggest all of you get on and do that survey to earn back those 4 percentage points to that exam two. Once everyone does that, the average would be right below a 70%. Okay. Once again, I'm hoping that goes up on the final now that we know what to expect and what resources you'll have available to you on that final exam. So we'll start today, and tomorrow we'll be going through Module 9, which is fiscal policy. We'll have a daily quiz today. We'll have a daily quiz tomorrow. That Module 9 reading, because we didn't have class yesterday, I reopened it, and I mentioned that in exam to be before we started class today. Most of you had already completed it. So that reopened version, because that date had already passed when we were supposed to have class, if you hadn't completed it, it looks like a new assignment. I'll kind of get those merged together later this afternoon so that, if you did it the first time or the second time, it's kind of merging these two assignments together. We also have that Module 10 reading, so that should be due before we start class on Thursday. Have a video I'm going to post along with today's recorded class on YouTube. I'll expect that you go through and at least watch that video on Module 10 before we start class on Thursday. I also have a daily quiz, which I'll post after class that's associated with this. At the very end, I work through some problems that will help you answer that daily quiz to get those questions correct. Really, if I'm being honest, Module 10, the questions that you would see on the quiz or the exam are really going to be related to what's covered in the last 15 minutes of that. The first part of it is kind of sets like first 25 minutes is really just setting up this idea of what the Fed is. I'm not going to ask specific questions about how it's constructed, but just to kind of give you some background information. And then where it leaves off is kind of jumps us into Module 11, where we can really understand what the effects of the tools that the Fed has, and that's going to be what we call monetary policy. So we'll start on Module 11 on Thursday, complete it on Friday. So that Module 11 reading is due before we start class on Thursday. I'll kind of get that published here after class as well. So Module 10, Module 10 I had assigned to be due before we start class Thursday. Module 11 is actually before we start class on Friday. Okay. Even though we'll start it on Thursday, I'm kind of giving a little bit of grace period to kind of so it matches up with originally what the syllabus said. That Canvas discussion that we had prior to the exam. Oh, where was it at? I think it's here. No, where did I put it? Probably on Module 8. That third Canvas discussion is due by the end of the day today. After class tomorrow, I'll put up a fourth Canvas discussion that'll be due next Tuesday. And then we'll have one Canvas discussion next week, do that Thursday before the final. And then we'll kind of cover Module 12 and 13 next week. I would assume that we'll have covered all that material by Wednesday, which means we'll have a review class once again that Thursday before the final. But things move quick. We're getting towards the end here. Okay. Other than that, the other thing I wanted to mention before we get going, if you're reviewing that midterm exam, there were 3 questions which I couldn't regrade since I'd already opened up the exam until after it had closed. So there was question 12 was the most egregious one. I meant to ask you for consumption. It asked you for disposable income, which you were literally given. Now, if you read it quickly and kind of knew the type of question, you probably did solve for disposable income, but which if you did, or sorry, solve for consumption. But if you did that, it wasn't counted as correct. And so I basically gave everybody credit for that one. But when you see the correct answer there, it's not for what is disposable income, it's what is for, or it's what should consumption be. And that's more so the type of question I would ask and you should review. On 10 and 16, I think it might have just been me accidentally scrolling on my mouse when I had selecting the answers. They were both fill in the blank questions. They had 3 parts. One of the part wasn't counting the correct answer correct, so I regraded those to score it correctly. Um, so when you look at it on your end, it doesn't show those regrading because I went through honor lock. Um, so if you have any questions about your score, if anything, it should only be a little bit higher than what it might look like. But it's the first part of both questions 10 and 16 that I regraded so that the correct answer was actually accepted. Okay. Um, other than that, the other thing I wanted to mention, if you're trying to go through and review that and match it up with your score, every other question is like all or nothing, but the fill in the blanks, for example, if there's three fill in the blanks, you get one correct, you would get 0.33 points. If you get two of the three correct, you get 0.66, etc. So those aren't graded for, you don't have to get every single part correct. They're graded partial credit, for how many you get correct. There was four and you get two of them correct, you would get half the points, 0.5. Okay. All right. So any other questions for me before we jump into material here today? Once again, I tried to outline all of this in the announcement, but if you need any further clarification, you can ask now or send me an email. Okay, so let's jump in. I can hit the mouse. There we go. To Module 9 material. So the final is only going to be over what we cover from today to the end of next Wednesday or next Thursday if we have a little bit of material to finish up. So we're going to reuse a lot of what we've already talked about, especially in Module 6, this kind of longer aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. But we're going to talk about the role of the government, and we talked about inflationary, deflationary gaps. What can the government do to kind of help resolve these? Okay. So really their main tools are going to be to increase or decrease government expenditures or increase or decrease taxes, right? So that we can close these inflationary, deflationary gaps. So one of the reasons why we want to close these gaps, if real GDP is too low, right? By increasing real GDP, we would kind of increase employment, lower unemployment. We can also, get the price to be what that long run price should be quicker. So we're going to have more price stability or lower inflation. Increasing real GDP through discretionary fiscal policy could also allow for economic growth or increases in real GDP. And then eventually next week, we'll talk about the international markets. We might be able to improve these as well. So we'll kind of hold off on that one probably until next week. But for today, we'll kind of think about if I was to break this down, right? We had current expenditures, we had transfer payments, we had overall consumption expenditures of the government, and then kind of non-defense, so defense and non-defense consumption. So all of these are going to be ways that the government can spend money, right? How they can increase their expenditures. So the total expenditures are kind of the sum of these three other categories, and we can kind of see they move in a generally the same direction. Sometimes national defense spending is trending downward while transfer payments are trending upward. But this is kind of the breakdown that we're thinking about. So government spending or expenditures was we call G. This was going to be one of the things that influenced aggregate demand. Okay. So we said if we increase spending, aggregate demand was C plus G plus I plus net exports. So increasing G, increasing our government expenditures would increase aggregate demand. If we decrease government spending, we're decreasing aggregate demand. So we're going back to that long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. So how does government spending can change? Well, we can spend more on our military. We put money towards education, government agencies, infrastructure of the country, right? There's all these areas in which they can increase or decrease spending. Okay. And infrastructure, think about this could be roads, bridges, right? Any kind of public good there or things that we're providing for the public. So, right, what if a recessionary gap exists? So I'll kind of go through this in the slides and I'll draw one out for you with an inflationary gap. So we said, when does a recessionary gap exist? Well, in this model, we said the long run equilibrium GDP is where that long run aggregate supply hits our aggregate demand. In the short run, we can see that the current equilibrium, where short run aggregate supply hits aggregate demand, is actually at a price that's too high, and that real GDP is too low. Anytime real GDP was too low, we called that a recessionary gap. So if this recessionary gap exists, what can the government do? Well, what we want to do is get real GDP to be higher. So we want to increase aggregate demand. How can the government increase aggregate demand? Well, this was the expenditure model. We said C plus I plus G plus net exports. If we increase spending, we're going to shift that aggregate demand curve to the right. So if we increase spending, we increase aggregate demand, what impacts is that going to have? Well, we've closed the gap. The short run GDP is now the same as the long run GDP. Now, before we said this gap would get closed by short run aggregate supply kind of adjusting. Here, we don't want to wait, right? We want kind of instant closing of this gap. We would see the government increase spending. That gets our long run potential GDP to be the same as our current GDP. Now, it will increase prices, right? But also by increasing GDP, we've increased employment. So it kind of has these positive impacts, but in some degree, it has a negative impact, which is that it increases prices even more so than what prices were at in the short run. So notice if we were at that original long run equilibrium, prices would be lower. The current short run equilibrium, prices are too high. Once we kind of correct for this recessionary gap, yes, we get to the same level of long run GDP, but it's come at a cost of higher prices. Okay? So this is kind of the government's response to a recessionary gap. So if we kind of look at the GDP per capita and we kind of look at our average investment rate, right? So this is going to be things that shift, these are factors of pull, they shift our long run aggregate supply. It may not be that we started out, like even if we were in the long run equilibrium, shifts in aggregate supply, we said could still cause short run inflation or deflationary gaps, long run supply increases or long run aggregate supply decreases. So we can still see that change in long run aggregate supply through pull. GDP increases as we see investment go up, or investment into these different factors. Productivity, we said other is usually we were just kind of focusing on capital, so investments into physical capital, labor supply, or education. So once again, reusing things we've already talked about. So when we have this increase in government spending, it's still going to be impacted, similar to what we talked about in prior modules with consumption. Autonomous consumption was changing real GDP by the multiplier effect, right? Every dollar consumed was having a larger change on real GDP. Same idea with government spending. Every dollar that we change government spending by, it gets multiplied by that multiplier, and it causes an even larger change in our real GDP. So if we were thinking about the following, so we have a consumption function. Oh, that's not showing up. I'll write this out for us. And we had increased government spending of 500. How much would GDP increase by? Okay. So this should look somewhat similar to what we did with consumption. So let's say we have the following consumption function, which was, what do I want here? Doesn't really matter. So we'll do 200 and then plus, what did I want here? Let's do 0.85 times disposable income. So this is our marginal propensity to consume. Now, when government spending goes up by 500, that money goes to someone. Even if it's a transfer payment, it goes to consumers. They don't spend all of it, right? So that marginal propensity to consume still impacts the level at which that $500 increase would impact our real GDP. So we said before, changes in kind of this real GDP were equal to we had what? Autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, net exports. We kind of had our taxes in here. And then over 1 minus MPC. Well, instead of looking at autonomous consumption, investment, or net export, we're just zeroing in on the effects of government spending. So we really already worked through these models that the change in our real GDP from government spending, well, if we took a derivative of this in respect to G, every dollar spent is changing it by 1 over 1 minus MPC. Okay. So if I kind of pull up my calculator here, if I have 1 over 1 minus, and here our marginal propensity to consume is 0.85, that would give us this money this multiplier of 6.66 repeated. If government spending was going up by 500, then what is the total effect or the total change in real GDP? Well, if this is the effect of $1, the effect of 500 would be that multiplied by 500, and we get approximately 3,333. So really, we already have kind of done this in an earlier module. Okay. So this is the idea that changes in government spending, the impact they'll have on real GDP, it's whatever that government spending is times this money multiplier. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So what we're going to do, it's a little bit different, and I have this on the following slide, so we'll kind of return to it, but since we're here, what if instead we didn't know the change in government spending? Right? Well, if I told you there's a recessionary gap of 1,000, so if we go back to that graph, a recessionary gap means that the short run GDP is too low. Right? It's lower than that long run. So we need to increase GDP to close that gap. So what change in government spending would cause our real GDP to change by 1,000? We're kind of working backwards here because we know that the change in real GDP we want is 1,000. We know that we're going to have this money multiplier of 1 over 1 minus 0.85, but we're looking for. So here, remember, this was 6.66. So that change in government spending that we would need would be what? 1,000 times, or sorry, divided by 6.66, which if I do that real quick, calculator, so that'd be what? 1,000 divided by 6.66. We get that the change in government spending that would be needed is approximately 150. I think it's like 150.15 here. Okay. So a lot of the times in this module, it's not going to be that we're determining what the effect of the additional government expenditure is, but what government expenditure is needed to close that $1,000 recessionary gap. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. Make sure here. Make sure my Zoom's not showing up, so I'll make sure I don't have any questions in the chat. Okay. So basically outline that here, all right, which is we have our kind of equation that we're looking at. We identify the marginal propensity to consume. We're just rearranging this to find what that change in government spending is. We said it was approximately 150. Okay. So what if instead we want to use taxes, right? Well, what change in taxes would cause the same change in real GDP, right? So we're now not increasing government spending, we're going to use taxes. So remember our consumption function was disposable income is the actual income minus what we're paying in taxes. So the tax change, the multiplier that we had was negative MPC over 1 minus MPC, which we could rewrite as negative MPC over marginal propensity to save. So we could kind of rewrite our function from before when we're looking at not government spending, but taxes. The effect of every dollar change in taxes on real GDP will be negative MPC over 1 minus MPC. So if I was working through an example here, right, and I'll actually go through just to kind of prove something to you. Let's not use these new values. If we have time, we'll kind of come back to this. But let's go back and use these values that we were using before. Okay. So here we go. So I'm going to go to share this again. Yeah, you guys can see this. So before we said that same $1,000 gap, in order to close that gap, we need to spend additional $150. Okay. Now, the change in real GDP if we're changing taxes, is whatever that tax change was times the marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Now, technically, we also have a negative sign up front here because we said that when we were finding kind of that break-even real GDP, it was autonomous consumption plus plus I plus G plus net exports minus that marginal propensity to consume times taxes over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So when we took a derivative of this in respect to taxes, well, if I lower taxes, that should increase GDP. So we're going to have this negative sign out front here. That if I want to increase that real GDP by 1,000, that was our original kind of recessionary gap, what is the change in taxes I would need? Well, I know that we had here 0.85. It's just a matter of rearranging this equation so we get the change in tax needed to close that $1,000 recessionary gap or deflationary gap is what? Negative 0.85 over 1 minus 0.85. So if we get this entered into our calculator, we'll see that the tax that we would need not doing this on the fly. Here we would need, oh, what did I not mess something up here? Dun, 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 dun. Oh, sorry, trying to make sure these values are correct. So here the change in tax we would need is approximately 176. I'm just rounding to the nearest integer there. So notice, to close that same recessionary gap, the change in government spending is actually going to be less than the change that's needed in terms of taxes. Okay. And that's because, right, we had that marginal propensity to consume, right? When we tax someone, they're not stopping the consumption of everything from that. They had part of that they were saving. And so the necessary change in taxes will always be greater than the necessary change in taxes to close that same recessionary gap. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Let me think here. So I think in the other example I have in the slides, so we'll kind of switch over to that. So by 176. Yeah, so we would need to change it by $176. Now, to make one more point here, to close the gap when we were using government spending, we had to spend an additional 150. That was money that we're kind of putting out there into the economy that grows our real GDP. Well, if I need to increase real GDP, what do I actually need to do? I don't increase taxes. What did I forget here? That change in taxes is actually negative, right? Government spending increases would cause real GDP to go up. In order to increase my real GDP, my taxes, I would actually need to go down. Okay. So, on a question on a quiz or exam, I would probably ask you, do they need to increase or, the possible options would be to decrease it by 176, increase it by 176, and I'd probably throw in distracting answers of increasing or decreasing by 150. Okay. There, we need to remember that with taxes, our multiplier is not 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. It's the marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus that. Any other questions on that?
So yeah, if we're increasing the change in tax, it's always going to be negative in marginal propensity to consume.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Think about why. If we increase taxes,
Yeah.
if there's more or less money out there, there's less.
So
So that's
then would there be a situation where we need a decrease or no? Real GDP?
we'll go through that here in a second.
Okay, okay.
Yep. All right. So just with some different values here and kind of asking you about in a different direction. So let's just assume we want to know the impact of reducing taxes by 600. Well, if we reduce taxes by 600, we're now not kind of working in reverse. We're just trying to figure out what that change in GDP was. So if I increase taxes by 600, I plug in my marginal propensity to consume here. It's, a pretty straightforward calculation. Now, what I need to remember is if taxes go down, what is that actually going to do? All right. Well, if taxes are going down by 600, I have a negative times a negative. That's actually going to cause my real GDP to go up. So increases in taxes cause GDP to go down. Excuse me. Excuse me. A reduction in taxes or decreases in taxes actually causes my real GDP to go up. And that's because I'd have like a negative times a negative here. Or the intuition that I'm lowering taxes, there's more money out there. I'm going to see real GDP go up. Okay. So we already kind of went through this idea that the impact of taxes is going to be slightly different because that multiplier effect doesn't have a 1 in the numerator. It's got that marginal propensity to consume. Now let's think about what if the marginal propensity to consume went up. So we've kind of went through these ideas before, but if the marginal propensity to consume goes up, right, what is that going to do? So there we go. So if the marginal propensity to consume increases, well, if this is increasing, I'm subtracting a larger value. My denominator is going up. If if the marginal propensity to consume increases, my numerator is going up. Both of those things are going to push real GDP to increase in the same direction. So increases in the marginal propensity to consume is going to increase the effect of that same $1 change in taxes. And the same would be true if we had government spending. It actually is even easier to think about because we said the change in real GDP from a change in government spending was 1 over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So once again, if this increases, we're subtracting a larger value that decreases our denominator. Smaller denominator increases this fraction. The same $1 in government expenditures would have a larger multiplier effect or would cause that real GDP to change by even more. So the higher the marginal propensity to consume, the required amount of taxes or government spending that would be necessary to close these recessionary gaps is actually smaller, right? That same $1 would have an even larger impact on real GDP, so we need to increase government spending or taxes by a fewer amount of dollars, right, or a smaller amount. Okay. Any other questions before we keep moving here? All right. So, um, what if instead, and this is kind of the question earlier, so what if we didn't decrease taxes? So we said decreases in taxes or increases in government spending helped increase real GDP or close these deflationary gaps. So if we instead increase taxes or decrease government spending, what are we helping to close? Inflationary gaps. So I've got this drawn out in the slides here, but I'm just going to kind of walk through it. All right, so I think drawing these out, just the more practice we get. If I'm just telling you there's a gap and I don't give you the visual, it's always good to be able to reproduce those. Okay, so we're looking at this long run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. We've got prices, we've got our initial aggregate demand, we've got our long run aggregate supply. And here we know that we have an inflationary gap. So if we have an inflationary gap, that means that the current GDP is greater than our long run potential GDP. So we know if this is kind of our long run GDP and our long run price level, that the short run aggregate supply must be somewhere out here, which causes our real GDP in the short run to be greater than the long run GDP, and our current price levels are too low. So if this is the case, right, now instead of thinking about relying on that short run aggregate supply to kind of adjust or inflationary expectations to kind of move us towards that long run outcome, we are impatient and we want to push it to that long run outcome immediately or quicker. Well, what are we going to do? We actually need to decrease real GDP. So here we had an inflationary gap. The way in which we close that is to reduce GDP. So if it comes to government spending, we're actually going to want to decrease government spending. Or if I want to decrease aggregate demand, right? So remember, aggregate demand was C plus I plus G plus net exports. And we could think about consumption. We had autonomous consumption plus marginal propensity to consume times YD. But YD here, when we now have taxes, if we increase taxes, that would decrease consumption, which decreases our aggregate demand. So decreases in government spending or increases in taxes would actually cause our aggregate demand to decrease, lowering our short-run GDP to match up with long-run GDP, closing that inflationary gap. And then we could work through numerical examples in the same way, which is basically everything just gets kind of flipped. And if we knew the change in government spending or taxes, we could back out what the total impact on real GDP was. Or if we know what that inflationary gap is, we would know the amount that we would have to increase taxes or decrease government spending to close that gap. Okay. Any questions there before we keep moving? And I've got some examples of this that we'll kind of go through here in a second. Numerical examples, sorry. Okay. Any questions on that before we go back to the slides here? Okay. So there's kind of a depiction here that we have in the slides. We said we would either increase taxes or decrease government spending to solve this inflationary gap issue. Now, just to make a point here, when we had this model, before we had the change in taxes or government spending, where were our prices at? Well, they were right here in the short run. When we change government spending or taxes, we essentially change the long run equilibrium. We change the long run equilibrium, or we push the current short run to that same level of GDP in the long run. But what have we done to prices? If aggregate demand stayed the same, our long run prices would actually increase. But because we've shifted that aggregate demand, we know that the long run prices, with that aggregate demand shift caused by a decrease in government spending or increase in taxes, will actually be lower than what they would be if we were just kind of. So by taking this approach to closing the inflationary gap, yes, we can kind of close that gap in real GDP, but it comes at a cost of that we've lowered prices. Or think about it this way, we've caused deflation. Okay. All right. So here's kind of a side by side, right? If the goal is to increase aggregate demand, we would call that expansionary fiscal policy. So that's what we were using. Kind of think about this as expansionary. We were increasing government spending so that we could increase real GDP to kind of close that gap, push the short run GDP higher to match up long run GDP. If the opposite was true and we wanted to decrease aggregate demand because we had inflationary gaps, we want to push that short run GDP to be lower to match up with a long run GDP. We would call this contractionary fiscal policy, right? Contractionary, we're reducing GDP. Expansionary, we're increasing GDP. And that's kind of nice because increasing aggregate demand or GDP, we do that by increasing government spending. Contractionary, we decrease aggregate demand by decreasing government spending. Now, the taxes are a little bit more tricky because they work in the opposite direction, right? To increase aggregate demand, we would actually decrease taxes, right? And then the flip side, if we want to decrease aggregate demand, we actually increase taxes. We take more money out of the pockets of individuals. Okay, where are we at on time? So we'll go through this, and then I think I'll switch back. We'll look at the daily quiz for today. So let's say that there's an aggregate demand decrease, and this isn't a result of anything the government did. So maybe consumption falls, maybe that marginal propensity to consume actually falls, maybe net exports fall, maybe investment falls. Something caused our aggregate demand to decrease. Okay? So, oh, actually, hold on. Typo here, right? Got a second example that we'll work through with the opposite strip. So, how can the government lighten the blow? All right, so we know that if aggregate demand decreases in the short run, we're actually going to end up with a recessionary gap. So I'll kind of draw this out for you here in a second. So how can the government lighten this blow or cause that deflationary gap to be lower? Well, we could spend more money on our welfare programs, spend more money on maybe unemployment compensation. So one of the things that when real GDP is lower, unemployment is higher. So we can increase government spending by giving out more unemployment benefits. Now, we could also, if we want to decrease, sorry, if we want to counteract that decrease in aggregate demand, we actually want to increase aggregate demand, which we would decrease taxes. Okay. So what is this going to look like? So I've got something in here, but I think I'm going to draw it out and then we'll kind of go back to the slides, I think. I don't know. I always think drawing this out and kind of talking through it is more helpful than just looking at the slides, which you can look at on your own, right? So let's say, and I'll build out a more complete model than what I have on the slides. So this is the value added of watching the videos completely or kind of attending class live here. So let's say this is my initial aggregate demand. Here's my short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply. Here's where GDP started out as. We know that should be the long run GDP or the long run equilibrium. Here would be kind of my initial price level or what would have been my long run price. Okay. If I see a change in something, consumption, investment in capital, where we said it actually causes aggregate demand to decrease, that's going to cause my short run GDP to be too low. So if that short run GDP is less than my long run GDP, we've got a recessionary or deflationary gap. We know that the prices in the short run are going to be too low, and GDP is too low as well. How could we soften the blow? We know that GDP, maybe we could even forecast this. We know that this change in investment in physical capital is going to occur. Or maybe there's things in the foreign market we know it's going to decrease net exports. How can we cause this recessionary gap to be smaller? Well, even if we can't perfectly predict what that decrease is going to be, if we increase government spending or expenditures, part of aggregate demand was G, so we increase G, we're going to increase aggregate demand. We can cause that short run price to be a little bit higher, and also our short run GDP to be a little bit higher. Now that recessionary gap isn't this full amount, we've reduced it by a little bit. So there won't be as large of a recessionary gap. Okay. What's another tool we have for fiscal policy? Maybe we don't put more money into unemployment benefits, right, or welfare programs. How would I increase aggregate demand through the use of taxes? Well, it's easy to think about this way. It's not completely the most accurate way to say it, but I think it helps to think about it this way. How do I put more money out there into the economy? Well, if I want more money out there, I would actually reduce the taxes that people have to pay. That would have the same increase in cause the same increase in my aggregate demand. And if it helps to think about the equation, why that is aggregate demand is going to be autonomous consumption plus that marginal propensity to consume times our income minus taxes plus I plus G plus net exports. So by reducing taxes, we're subtracting a smaller number that's actually going to cause my aggregate demand to increase. And then increases in government spending also cause my aggregate demand to increase, right? Two different tools the government has. Any questions there before we keep moving? Okay with that? So this is the idea of automatic stabilizers, right? We know aggregate demand is going to decrease. We want to soften the blow. We're going to increase government spending or decrease taxes, kind of move that short run GDP a little bit higher, causing there to be a lower recessionary gap. Now, before we get to kind of budget deficits here, make sure. So we'll go here, access this. Let me make sure I've got the settings so we've got more than ample time because I think I'm going to add some things in here based off of what we've talked about. So we should have plenty of time to kind of get all these questions answered. So let's go here. All right. So let's say we have this consumption function. We know what disposable income is. If we want to use taxes to close the gap, how much will we have to increase them by or decrease them by to close that gap? So we don't know what the recessionary gap is here. I've simplified this just to thinking about what if it was only consumption. So we're not talking about investments or net exports. We're just going to focus on consumption. We know what disposable income is. We don't know what taxes are. Okay. So here I've got consumption is equal to 0.7 times the disposable income plus 500. Okay. So we know that the potential level of GDP, or if we were spending all of our disposable income, should be this kind of $1,000. Right? So if that was the case, right, we plug that in, we get what? 700 plus 500 is $1,200. So that's what consumption could be, right? However, we've got, if we're thinking about what taxes are, right? Sorry, uh, that's what consumption would be. So here we've got the actual level of consumption is greater than our disposable income, right? 1,200 is greater than 1,000. So you think about the actual consumption, if it's greater than our disposable income, we can kind of think about this as the short run GDP is currently greater than what we know the GDP would be in the long run. So we've got what type of gap? An inflationary gap. So if we've got this inflationary gap, what do we need to do? Right? Well, we said if GDP is too high, we need to decrease GDP. Right? Now, if we rewrite this consumption function to include taxes, we've got an inflationary gap of 200 that we want to close. So in order to decrease GDP, what are we going to have to do? We're actually going to have to increase taxes. Okay. How much do we need to increase them by? Well, the change in our real GDP was equal to the change in taxes times that marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus it. Right? So here our marginal propensity to consume is 0.7. So negative 0.7 over 1 minus 0.7. Right? We don't know the change in taxes. That's what we're looking for. But we know that that change in real GDP is we need to decrease GDP by $200. So from here, it's a little bit of math. So we'll figure out what that multiplier is. So it's 0.7 divided by 1 minus 0.7. So this is approximately 2.33. Now remember, there's a negative sign out front. So to then find that change in taxes, I kind of divide both sides by negative 2.33. I would have that change in taxes that would be necessary. It's 200 divided by 2.33 repeated, or we get approximately what, to the nearest integer. Am I looking at this right? 86. Yep. Okay. And there, we actually were increasing taxes, so we don't have a negative sign, right? It's going to be positive. Okay. Any questions on that? All right, so the second question is, if an inflationary gap exists, then in order to help close this gap, what should government spending do? Well, we had an inflationary gap here. We wanted to decrease GDP. Well, if we don't use taxes, how can we decrease GDP? We said we would decrease government spending. Right? Now, if we were using taxes, then what must be true about the change in taxes relative to the change needed from government spending? Well, we worked through an example earlier, and we said that the change in taxes, because that numerator is not one, our multiplier effect is always going to be a little bit lower. We're going to need to change taxes by an even larger amount than government spending. So the taxes that we would need to eliminate this gap would have to be larger than the change that would be needed in government spending. And we'll kind of prove this here in a second, but just to kind of make sure you're getting those answers to the quiz in correct. Um, that first one we said was 86. The second one would be, I'll check the chat here in a second, decrease and then larger. Now I think I'll have to go in after this. I think I had it to the first decimal here, right? So 85.7, I rounded it to the nearest integer. I'll go in later, set the margin of error after we're done with class today so that it accepts anything within one, so that 86 would be counted as correct. Okay. Yeah, chat here before we keep moving. So we want the consumption disposable. Essentially, yeah, I'm simplifying this example so that if disposable income, that's like our um, potential GDP, if it's the same as consumption, that was like the idea that we had going back. We had that 45-degree line. We wanted our disposable income to be equal to consumption. That's when we would have no gap. Right? It's kind of a two-part question there. We had to figure out if we had an inflationary deflationary gap, what was the value of it? Then knowing that value, what would the change in taxes necessary be to close that gap? Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Um, Now just to kind of add in, since we're here already, let's think about a second scenario. So let's say I had that same inflationary gap, and then I still needed that change in GDP to be negative 200. I need to reduce GDP. Well, if I'm doing that with government spending, its multiplier was 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Here, this was 0.7. So if I figure out the multiplier for government spending, 1 over 1 minus 0.7 would be 3.33. So notice every dollar spent on government spending has a larger impact on real GDP than every dollar kind of increase or decrease in taxes. Well, if I wanted to decrease GDP, I'd actually need to decrease my government spending. And by what amount? It's just rearranging this equation, right? Negative 200 over 3.33. So that would give us approximately negative 60, right? So I would either have to increase taxes by 86 to get that same $200 decrease in GDP as only a $60 change in government spending. But they work in opposite directions, right? Decreasing government spending is the same as increasing taxes. Okay. Any questions on that one before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So go back to the slide. So I've got some government spending stuff here. What do I want to do? Let's try Well, we'll go this. We might run out a little bit of time, but we can kind of pick up with these examples at the beginning of next class. So, with this idea in mind, of using fiscal policy by increasing, decreasing taxes or increasing, decreasing government spending, how is that going to influence the budget of the government? So we said in a previous module, public savings represents our government's budget. So the public savings was taxes minus our transfer payments and then minus government spending. So a balanced budget would be if this is equal to zero, right? Our taxes are exactly equal or our revenue is exactly equal to our expenditures. If taxes are ever less than our expenditures, we're spending more money than we're bringing in, we would have a deficit. If we are ever generating taxes that are greater than our expenditures, we have a budget surplus. So we can think about what impacts is this fiscal policy going to have on the budget of the government. Right? Oops, there we go. So if we look at just kind of the data, I don't know, it's like the last 20 years or so, um, the receipts, or you can think about this as like the tax revenue of the government, is always less than their expenditures. So what do we always have? A deficit. The government is pretty perpetually in a deficit. Now, that might be okay if that deficit is caused by changes in government spending or taxes that's alleviating some of these recessionary or inflationary gaps, right? So if we looked at the actual surplus and deficit, notice it's always negative. We always have a deficit. Okay? So let's think through the government's responses to different scenarios and why that might be causing our budget deficit or surplus to change. So let's say we have an inflationary gap, right? Something changes that causes aggregate demand to increase. So if we have this consumption function, just working through more examples here so we get good practice at this. We've got our marginal propensity to consume is 0.6, our autonomous consumption is 500, and let's say the inflationary gap we have is 700. What amount of government spending is needed to eliminate this gap? Well, if we have an inflationary gap, and we're told, first of all, if it's inflationary, we know that the GDP is currently too high. So how can we push this back to the long run amount? We need to decrease GDP in the short run. That's our inflationary gap. We're told that that inflationary gap is 700. GDP is $700 too high, or 700 million, whatever unit we're looking at. So how much do we need to change government spending to close this gap? Well, we said our marginal propensity to consume was 0.6. So the change in real GDP that we need to reduce it by 700. We need to decrease that aggregate demand curve, right? So we're thinking about here, we started out and we're at a point where something caused there to be aggregate demand was too high and that the short run GDP was greater than our long run GDP. So we want to push, right? We want to push GDP down to match that long run level. So we want to decrease it so that our aggregate demand after we kind of use this fiscal policy is that it pushes aggregate demand back to what it was before that shift. So we said the change in real GDP is the change in government spending times this multiplier effect. So if I plug in 0.6 here, I got what? 1 over 1 minus 0.6 is approximately, not approximately, it is 2.5, right? So here's just a little bit of algebra, and I get that change in government spending needed is negative 700 over 2.5, or what? So $280, right? Now I have to be careful here. It's 280, but how does government spending change aggregate demand? Well, if I want it to decrease, I need to not spend more money. I need to decrease government spending by $280. Okay. Any questions on that? And if I want a general form of this equation, I have it in the slides here. If I rearrange this without the values, that change needed in government spending will always be that change in real GDP divided by 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And here I was thinking about what the change is needed if we want to worry about kind of the directions. We said that we would actually want to reduce real GDP, so we need to decrease government spending or kind of have this negative $280 change. Here, the way I had it in the slides was just thinking about what's the change mean, what's the absolute value. Any questions on that before we kind of move to our second tool that the government has? Okay, so let's think through what else could they do, right? Well, we said they don't have to just decrease government spending. We could increase taxes. Now, if I set this up, right, what is the same change in taxes needed? We've got the same marginal propensity to consume, the same inflationary gap. We said that the multiplier effect for taxes is always going to be smaller. So we're always going to need a larger change in taxes to achieve the same goal as changing government spending. So here, hopefully when we go through this, we find that the change needed in taxes is greater than what we just found, which was $280. Okay? So once again, we could kind of work through this. We have the change in real GDP that we need. We need to reduce it by 700. We've got the marginal propensity to consume was 0.6. It's just a matter of plugging these in. Now we had to reduce GDP by 700, so it's negative here. We just rearrange this equation a little bit. Now notice a negative over a negative. We get that change in taxes. We don't need to reduce taxes to lower aggregate demand. We actually need to increase taxes. So the same dollar change, instead of 280 to close that $700 inflationary gap, we would need to increase taxes by 466. So a much larger change is necessary to close that same $700 inflationary gap if we're using taxes. Any questions on that? So I think I have a third scenario, but I want to make sure we leave off in a good place. Okay. So if we have, I shouldn't say if we have time. We'll go through option 3 if we have time today. I might start with it next class. It's a little bit more difficult, kind of combining what we've talked about in class today, but I want to point out 2 other things. Okay. Now, one of them I've already mentioned, but I want to kind of prove this to you. So could there be, yes, that's option 3. So like I said, I don't think we'll have time today, but we'll start out tomorrow's class doing a combination of the 2. Okay. So what I want to focus on today, so we can kind of bring this into that third option or that third example that we'll have tomorrow, is why is the change needed in taxes always greater? Well, when we're thinking about the change in real GDP that came from a change in government spending, this was kind of that, how we calculated that. Now, the change in real GDP that came from taxes was this. If we ignore the negative sign for a second, we just know that the dollar change needed in government spending for an inflationary gap was we have to reduce it or increase taxes, or if it was a recessionary gap, we had to increase government spending and reduce taxes. We just care about kind of what the absolute value or the size of that change is. We're just going to ignore this negative sign for a second. Okay. So what would cause, right? These were the equations that we were using to calculate the change in real GDP. Well, if we wanted the same change in real GDP, these 2 should be the same. From here, I do a little bit of algebra. I multiply both sides by 1 over the marginal propensity to consume. I now have the change in government spending is equal to the change in taxes times that marginal propensity to consume. So the marginal propensity to consume, what's the highest it could ever be? 1. Now, in reality, we never see it be 1, right? That marginal propensity to consume is always something less than that, right? People don't spend all of their income. So that same change in taxes, if it's being multiplied by something that's less than one, when we're thinking about what does that relationship between taxes and government spending need to be? Well, if this is multiplied by something that's less than one, excuse me, um, that change in government taxes the change in government spending that's needed is always going to be less than that change in tax, right? So if I had like 1,000 here, well, if I did have that tax change of 1,000, it's going to get multiplied by something less than one. It's always going to be less. So in order to get that same change in real GDP, I know the change in taxes has to be greater. Or I think about it this way, that change in government spending, that would give me the same change to real GDP as a change in taxes, always being divided by something less than one. That change in tax, this is, something less than one, that change in tax would always be greater than that change in government spending. So that's why, right, if we're just looking at it from a mathematical standpoint, that's why that statement or relationship exists. Okay. So what is this going to do, right, in terms of our budget? Well, if we had an inflationary gap, that's what we just kind of worked through. We said that we needed to either decrease government spending or increase taxes. Everything would work in the exact opposite direction. If I can hold on to my markers here, for a recessionary or a deflationary gap. There, we actually wanted to increase GDP. So we would have to either increase government spending or decrease taxes. Well, if we think about our budget of the government, it was taxes minus government spending minus these transfer payments, right? So what's going to happen if we increase taxes, right? Or we decrease government spending? Well, this causes my budget to go up. This causes my budget, subtracting a smaller number, to go up. Either one of these tools would cause that budget of the government. It's more likely it's going to be positive, or it's more likely that it's going to cause a budget surplus. Now, down here, if we have a recessionary gap, and to kind of alleviate or eliminate that gap, we had to increase government spending or decrease taxes. Well, if I lower taxes or I subtract a larger number, that's actually going to cause my budget to go down. So instead of a surplus, that's going to be more likely that I'm creating a deficit. So what, because the government typically sees, or we typically see when we're looking at that data, that they were always running a deficit, what is what does the government respond to more? Well, if we always see a deficit, they must be using these fiscal policy tools not to solve inflationary gaps. They must be using it to solve or to alleviate recessionary gaps. So this kind of makes sense. Like if things are good, the current GDP is high, the government's not as concerned about achieving this long run equilibrium. We can kind of wait, right? We can wait for that short run aggregate supply to adjust and get to that long run outcome. However, when things are bad, right, we want to alleviate, right, those times where we want to kind of help reduce that recessionary gap. So we see them using fiscal policy more likely in response to recessionary gaps, which is why we're more likely to see the government run a deficit compared to a surplus. We're not as patient when GDP is too low. Any questions on that idea? Okay. Um, hmm, okay. So, yeah, 5 minutes here. Yep. Let's think if we had a slightly more difficult scenario. Okay. So let's say we had an inflationary gap of 700, marginal propensity to consume of 0.6. So we're kind of returning to those old values we were looking at. Assume that we increase taxes and cause GDP to fall by 200. If we want to completely eliminate this inflationary gap, what would we have to do? Right? What should the change in government spending be? Well, we are just told that the initial gap was 700. Our marginal propensity to consume is 0.6. If we've reduced that gap from taxes by 200, our new gap is 500. So what do we know if we have an inflationary gap? Our GDP currently is too high. So we want to decrease that GDP even more. So we've already decreased it using taxes. We increased taxes, which pushed GDP down, but not enough. We still have this inflationary gap of 500. So the second thing we could then couple with that is, okay, we change taxes, but we can simultaneously change government spending or government expenditures. Well, the change in real GDP is the change in government spending times 1 over 1 minus this marginal propensity to consume. Well, we still need to lower real GDP by $500. We don't know. We're looking for what change in government spending would do this, but we know our marginal propensity to consume. Okay? So at this point, once again, it's just a matter of kind of doing the math. Multiplier effect is, we had this before, was 2.5. So the change in government spending, if I just divide both sides by 2.5 here, I get that the necessary change in government spending, right, must be 200. And not just 200, but negative 200. Okay. Any questions on it? So we can kind of use both of these tools simultaneously to close these gaps. So two more things I want to point out before we end class. So in respect to our budget, how did we close this inflationary gap? We decreased government spending, and we said to get this, we had to then increase taxes. So what were we more likely to see caused by this simultaneous change? Well, both of these are causing our budget to go up, or we're more likely now to have a surplus relative to before. Now, just as a thought experiment, what if I was trying to use these two tools at the same time, but using the data and using my expectations of what taxes impact we're going to have, I incorrectly identified how much this gap wasn't 700, it was something else, right? Or I changed government spending and taxes in the wrong way. So what if my change in taxes reduced GDP by 200, but when I changed government spending, maybe I chose an amount that was wrong and I reduced GDP by 700. Well, my GDP before was $700 too high. Well, if I reduce this by 900, I've actually now caused my short run GDP to not be equal to my long run GDP. I've actually caused it to be too low. So if I make an error in this way, what did I actually do? I went from an inflationary gap to I actually caused a deflationary gap. Okay. So if the government overestimates how much spending they need to reduce this inflationary gap, they could kind of change things from being GDP was too high to GDP is now currently too low. So anytime we run these deficits, we risk that we've incorrectly identified the amount of that inflationary gap, and we've actually switched it to now be GDP is too low. We now have a deflationary gap. So now what do we do in response? We spend less or we kind of decrease taxes. Okay. Or sorry, that was the initial. Oh, sorry. We would either, to solve this deflationary gap now, we either need to increase government spending or we need to decrease taxes. The exact opposite of what we were originally doing. Okay. All right. So We'll kind of end class there today. Just as a reminder, nothing, the only thing due is that Canvas discussion at the end of the day today. Also, that extra credit exam survey. Make sure you're getting on and getting that done before the end of the day today. Tomorrow, we'll finish up Module 9, and I might touch on, if we have time, a little bit of what was in that Module 10 video. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, or I'll kind of leave this open here for a couple minutes, but I'm going to stop the recording right here.